All right, this is the Self-Directed Help Seeking and Skill Growth Project in the Agile Research Studio SIG, a special interest group in design technology and research. I am Shankar Salwan, and I will be presenting you my research findings from this quarter, all that I have done, all the problems I've unfolded and discovered, along with next steps I've identified. Um, so let us begin. So, just a brief introduction of what I'll be going over in my talk today is I'll be introducing the problem statement that I'm working on, the design arguments and user journey map that's identified, the prototypes I've built that's identified through expert modeling and need finding, user tests I've done on these prototype and the results I found on them, and I will end with the next steps I've identified for my project. So to introduce the problem statement, here we're focusing on novice users in who are working on independent research projects in a self-directed learning community. So for these novice users are identified by members who are new to the community, who have just started their projects and have less than about a year and a half of experience in the community. Novice users can also extend to people who have a year and a half of experience in the community but still struggle with help seeking. Um, so, novice users tend to have a struggle with firstly identifying what the help seeking need is, and secondly, identifying helpers for the help seeking needs. So, the first problem that they struggle with is identifying of help seeking needs. This is due to a lot of the problems that they face being very abstract, conceptual, and new to them, which leads them to not being able to identify specifically what about a task is blocking them and why is it a blocker. It's more of users feeling stuck and not knowing what to do and heavily relying on mentors to get feedback and kind of help them analyze their situation and understand what their need is and further dive into help seeking and resolving their problems. And lastly, for help identification, a lot of novice users lack awareness of specific experiences and expertise of users, of helpers in the community. So, for example, someone needs help with, let's say, identifying qualitative measures in a study design. A lot of novice users would tend to just go to their mentors for feedback or faculty because they're not able to identify other helpers in the community who've probably worked on a study design and specifically worked on developing qualitative measures for their study. And due to this, they're not able to identify these people, and since they're not identifying them, they can't leverage them. And with dependency on faculty and mentors, novice users tend to delay their help seeking needs for um, special events in the community, such as studio, their special interest group meetings, and office hours. And this results in users actually delaying sometimes progress in their research because they hold back onto something. They might work on another task, but truly, when this blocker is resolved, they can make significant progress. So, based on these identified problem statements, this is just a small map of what identified outcomes, obstacles, and characteristics are, and I'll be showing a user journey map too. So, we've broken the outcomes down for identification of help seeking needs in two aspects and identifying of helpers into two aspects. So, when a user is identifying help seeking needs, what users should be able to do is firstly say exactly what about a blocker is challenging, as in what's specifically about, taking the last example of qualitative measures is difficult for them to unravel. Is it that they do not know qualitative measures? Is it that they're not sure if their qualitative measures cover what they need to do? And what about it is difficult? So, users being as specific as possible as to what about it is challenging. And this outcome was identified through need finding of grad students and other helpers who've said that when identifying, when being a helper, they always like to know specifically what's challenging. It's only then they can engage well in the help seeking request. Otherwise, it's more of a process to find out what exactly is challenging. And secondly, users should be able to identify why the blocker challenges their research. And this is taken from literature where there were studies done in agile communities where it was seen that when users are able to map onto their canvas and prioritize, the canvas is a tool used in DTR for research. If they're able to map to their canvas and have a conceptual mapping of what exactly they need to do, they're able to prioritize their needs a lot better and specifically identify exactly what about it is challenging them from making progress. In identifying helpers, users should be able to firstly identify helpers across the community. It's not just their SIG faculty or mentors, but anyone in the community who has experience should be identified. And lastly, users should be able to select the best helpers for a given specific task or specific help seeking need that they have. So the obstacles, as I've discussed before in the problem statement, are kind of similar to what is listed here. And I'll briefly just jump into the user journey map I have here. So for the prototype I am developing is, so we've broken it down into two aspects. So identification of help seeking need and then identification of helper. So in identification of help seeking needs, it's this is, let's say, a novice user who's trying to get help for their design arguments but don't know what to do. They interact with the help seeking scaffold. They're first prompted, what is your blocker? So user lists what the blocker is. Then users are prompted to reflect on why do they feel they're blocked about something. Users are prompted to think about a blocker more and possibly challenge themselves to think about what exactly is blocking them and why do they feel blocked. And lastly, the user should be able to identify how the blocker is related to progress in the research, and this helps them kind of map it back as seen in literature, what would help users work. And there's an analysis of experts as well as novice on the side. So look at the canvas, they identify exactly what it is, a section on the canvas, and then they fill out the help request as concisely as possible and identify a domain from a set of domains given. And this then leads to identification of helpers and moves to the next scaffold, which you will see soon in the prototype. So the prototypes tested was, the first one was just scaffolding, help seeking identification. So in that process, what we worked on was listing a set of helpers in the community and identifying and giving information to users about specific experiences they have. Then the second user test done was only on two users, which was to prompt help seeking need identification and help identification, and was modeled, the help identification was modeled more specific to the help request compared to the first prototype. So without further ado, I'd just like to jump into the prototypes right now. So this is the first prototype designed, and we'll be going over the same user, where the user was given information of time spent in DTR, whether a helper is a graduate or an undergraduate, experience in the domain, which was calculated by seeing the amount of times people have done a learning module related to the task at hand in the domain, and also if they've applied it to the project or not. If they've applied to the project multiple times, they have a higher rating. And if they've recently done it, they have a lower rating and have just done it for the first time. Recent work in their project, which is taken from their sprint log. The learning modules they've worked on, taken from the individual progress map. And the next, availability. So only a few people had official availabilities available from open office hours that they run in the community. The rest are noted as Slack, so they can reach out to them. And the findings from this prototype is, so from the first prototype, we were able to see that the users are actually able to identify members across the community. The users listed 2 out of 3 helpers outside of their special interest group, so they're broadening identification and they're able to see other people's experiences. But what users kind of struggled with the first prototype was when looking at recent work in their project, they felt like it's not specific to their need, and experience level is kind of vague. They don't know how it's calculated, so they don't have any trust. And learning modules worked on helps a bit, but they don't know the extent to which someone's worked on the learning module because the system's not providing any information about that. So while Carol had identified about 3 helpers with the help of this prototype, other users who'd worked, who'd interacted with this prototype stated a lot of difficulties in actually using the scaffold. It gave them great information, but it didn't change most of their decisions in help seeking. All right. And back to the second prototype we tested. So based on the results from this prototype, we worked on identifying a better way to scaffold help identification, and at the same time, working on a part before that identified was identifying a help request. Because I've seen here, a user stated their blocker, and I helped them identify a help request. They didn't identify it themselves, and it required some scaffolding. So it led to the design of the second prototype, which, as can be seen here, is a list of prompts in the beginning where users are first asked what their blocker is, why is it a blocker, and how does it relate to their research. And based on their responses, asking them to concisely express all the thoughts that they've had related to the blocker as a help request and identify a domain. So the same user here was Carol, and as uh, as I saw in user testing her while she was thinking out loud, she was actually able to, once these prompts were given to her, think very deeply about what problem she's facing instead of rushingly just thinking about a help request and going ahead with it as she does in pair research. And in identification, what changed here was I had identified specific experiences with respect to the request given, and this was identified through my own personal experiences with helpers in the community. Their sprint logs, their individual progress maps, going over a little bit of their GitHub, and also checking in on them if they could help me with anything. So with Carol, I didn't give specific learning module experiences as I could not cover everything and I didn't want to give any false information. And recent work in project again was taken from their sprint log, and it was just the most recent sprint. And time in DTR is kind of like a correlation to students being undergraduate or graduate also, and it helps infer a lot of decisions for them. Um, so coming back, the results from this user test showed that the identification prompt, as I discussed while talking to Carol, I could see that she's able to think about her blocker more deeply and get a little more specific with her needs. At the same time, she found it a little. She didn't say it was difficult, but talking to her mentor, it was seen that while the prompts helped her think a little more, it wasn't the right guided scaffold. It was more of there were more layers to her conceptual problem that she did not identify and she was not able to go over. So, for her given prompt, she was working on study design, and study design have a lot to do with design arguments too. And she was not able to identify that, hence, given her difficulty in her identification. And but on the hindsight, giving specific information about helpers allowed users to identify helpers a lot better. And this led to much better identification. And the helpers reached out to said 6 out of 7 helpers reached out from the 2 user tests, said they could all help the user with the given task. So takeaways is as I've discussed before, from mentor feedback on the last user test, we were seeing that for identification of blockers, we need to get a little more specific, and users should be able to identify exactly what in it is a problem. And the problem identified with the scaffolds were when relating back to the canvas, saying just a specific section is not enough. In a section, they need to get a little more detail with what they're working on. And for identifying helpers, we need to develop a huge system because we found what helps users identify, but we don't know how to model it in real life, which was just a visit of ours done by me there. So next steps is finding more literature to support the prompts that I have to support help seeking needs identification, because this is a reflective process that needs proper backing as to how it should be structured. Um, and developing new prompts and simultaneously working on building a proper system for helpers in the community to support the identification process. And finally, working on new arguments as well as prototypes from all the need finding and work I've done. Thank you so much. This was a great quarter. Looking forward to another quarter of research.